So I won't waste any more time now. So I'll pass the time to Mary. Can you say a few words to welcome our participants and introduce the new team, please?
Hello, thank you very much, Ruby. Yes, I'm Barry Mackenzie and I'm based at the University of Glasgow. And I also would like to welcome you to the 4th Social Policy and Society annual lecture. It's really great to see so many people here, despite the technological vagaries of joining an alien team. And also because we're currently competing in the Euros viewing wars. So I think it's great that we've got so many people here today. I think it's also fair to say that during pandemic times, what we lose out in face-to-face connectivity with this kind of event, we gain in geographical accessibility and other kinds of accessibility. So today's event has a dual purpose. We're here not just to hear and discuss Zoe and Kevin's lecture with its highly resonant title. Zoe and Kevin, you're very welcome today, and you will have a formal introduction from Alessio very shortly. But we're also here to formally launch our new editorial team. Ruby Chow and Alessio D'Angelo from the University of Nottingham, and supported by Colleen Cusworth as editorial assistant. It seems a long while ago now that Ruby and Alessio submitted their exciting editorial team application to the journal and to the SPA executive. Amid some very stiff competition, I should say. But they took up the reins officially in January of this year, and Colleen joined us a matter of weeks ago. And we're really looking forward to hearing what developments you have in store for the journal. Some of those were set out in your application. But before looking to the future, I also wanted to take the opportunity to again thank your predecessors, Magella Kilkie, Liam Foster and Shona Kirk as editorial assistant, all from Sheffield University. And the previous team saw the journal go from strength to significant strength, including its first exciting steps into the land of the impact factor. So who knows where we can go from here. Members of the board and contributors to the journal will, I'm sure, be keen to join me in a round of thanks to all three of the previous editorial team for their enthusiasm, efficiency and eagle eyes. So we can maybe all do a little round of applause for Magella, Liam and Shona. And Ruby, would you like to pass back now to, I'm not sure if Liam and Magella are actually here just now, or to Shona?
Hi, everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, Magella.
Hi, thanks very much, Barry. Thank you, Ruby. A quick, very last minute change of plan. Liam, I think, had communicated with you, Ruby, that he would speak, but he's been in the wars today, unfortunately. He's had an accident. He's not serious, but he's just got back from hospital and is bandaged up and not feeling like doing this, unsurprisingly. So I said I would speak on behalf of all of us. So firstly, thank you very much, Barry, for those really kind words about our time as editors, and I am speaking on behalf of myself and Liam, and also Shona, who is here. I think I saw her name on the list of participants earlier. And to Ruby and Alessio, thank you very much for inviting us to share in this lovely event with you as you take on your the editorship of the journal, and to be part of the event that has the great speakers in Kevin and Zoe. So I'm sure it will be a real success. So just to kind of really say thank you to everyone who supported us in our time as editors of the journal. We had really supportive chairs in the form of Vary in the latter years, but before that, Nicola Yates, and a brilliant editorial board, some of whom are also here today, who were always supportive and helpful and kind of stepped in when we needed that quick turnaround with peer reviews often. We also had some lovely colleagues at the SPA, which of course sponsors the journal, as Ruby was saying at the beginning. In our time, chairs at the SPA, Nick Allison, Jane Miller and Karen Rollinson, and colleagues too at CUP, Hannah Patrick and Holly O'Neill. Liam did tell me this was a little bit like an Oscar speech that he was passing on to me as I go through the thanks. It feels a bit like that, but genuinely, you can't do this role, as I'm sure Ruben and Alessio are realising, without all the other colleagues who contribute to making the journal function. And of those, most important had to be for us Shona Kirk as our editorial manager role, who just did an absolutely fantastic job. And Liam and I always said how glad that we recruited Shona that day. It was a really competitive. Vary mentioned the competition around the editors themselves, but recruitment of the editorial support was also very competitive, and we were so pleased that we recruited Shona. So thank you, Shona, for making our job so much easier. And just to pass back to Ruby and Alessio, we really do hope that you enjoy the role. We know that the journal is in really safe hands, and we wish you every success in the future. So the very best of luck, colleagues.
Thank you, Majella. I'm sure that you have made a very good Oscar speech. That is very, very helpful, and thank you very much for your good wishes, and thank you, Mary, for your introduction of the new team. So now I won't cause any delay because we have started late already. So I'll pass the time to Alessio to tell us something about the latest development of the journal.
Okay, thank you very much, Ruby. Hello, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. Yes, I intended to give a very brief presentation about the journal, although, to be honest, being conscious of the time and aware that most people are probably keen to hear on our annual lecture as soon as possible, I'll keep it very brief. I mean, if you are here at this meeting, you probably know a little bit about social policy and society anyway. Again, maybe to begin, I would like, I'm not going to give another Oscar presentation, but I would like to really thank you, Majella and Liam and Shona and Vary and all the members of the editorial board for their support in kind of handing over from the previous editorial team to ours, because they've been incredibly supportive and collegial and very helpful, particularly in those first few days where, well, I don't know you, Ruby, but I fell a little bit out of my depth. I won't tell so much about how I'm feeling right now, but yes, we're doing our best to kind of building on the great work of our predecessors. So really, to an extent, what the journal is about is what is always aiming to be about since its establishment in the early 2000s. Really a platform, a space for discussions around social policy issues, and particularly exploring the relationship between social policy in itself and its impact on society. And so in doing that, I suppose some of the strengths of the journal are the fact that the journal really brings together contributions from across the social sciences. It's in a certain sense is a interdisciplinary journal as well as being a social policy journal, because it's really about looking at social policy issues from a variety of perspectives and from a variety of national, local, and international perspectives and case studies, and developing even further the kind of international angle is one of the things that Ruby and I try to put at the forefront in the next 5 years. the other element we are really keen on and would like to again develop even further is having the journal also as a space of collaboration between academics, but also policy researchers from the third sector, for example, practitioners as well. So we continue, and even more than before, we are encouraging submissions of kind of collaborative papers of that kind. And then, as many of you probably know, one of the peculiarities of SPS is the fact that we have in every issue a theme section, which is usually guest edited by one or usually more people. So that allows us to keep kind of a generalist approach, but also to go a bit more in depth every issue on some particular issues. And in fact, the annual lecture that you're going to hear later today is underpinned by a special issue that Kevin and Zoe got published in January, on which we'll say a little bit more later, which is also still available online, free access right now, I think till the end of the month. So you may want to kind of take the opportunity right now. The last theme section was on a topic which is quite close to my own area of research. We had a theme section by Ratman and Sharawi on the undeserving migrants, issues about bordering and access to social services. And we've got many more in the pipeline. And to mention one very important example, we're looking forward to a forthcoming theme section by Cole, Craig, and Ali on race, learning, and teaching social policy, which is part of the work that the SPA is supporting around race and social policy in general, and teaching race in social policy in particular. So again, we look forward to seeing all these new issues in the coming months. We'll keep doing our best to, again, keep in the steer, but really, like many other journals, this is also very much the product of collective collaboration. So thank you very much to all the authors and the guest editors. We've got some news to announce, more on the practical and technical sense, but very important as well. So I'm now giving the floor to Colleen, who's going to tell you what that is about. Colleen, over to you, please.
Thank you. So I wanted to make you aware, you probably already have received an email, that SPS has now launched its submission and peer review site. So that went live on the 1st of June, and it can be available on mc.manuscriptcentral.com/SPAS. If you take anything away from what I say over the next minute or two, it is if you have any queries, if you encounter any issues, please just email spseditors@nottingham.ac.uk. So in terms of why we went about introducing the submission and peer review site, we wanted to provide a platform for authors to have visibility of their content from the point of it being submitted through to the point of having a decision. So authors will be able to submit articles or proposals via this site and track their progress through to a decision. Reviewers will be able to get instant access to manuscripts at the point of agreeing to review a paper, and they'll be able to access the manuscript and score sheet from wherever they are. And guest editors going forward will be able to manage the peer review of their theme sections using the site too. The peer review process is very administrative, and so this is going to help to reduce some of that administrative burden, and in turn it should reduce the time from submission to first decision and submission to final decision. So in terms of what we'd be looking for you to do, if you can go onto the site, if you've got an account, please log in. If you haven't, then please create an account. Just update your contact details and put in some keywords that best describe your areas of expertise and interest. And then we can make sure we match the right papers with the right reviewers. And if you're an author, if you can submit any new or revised manuscripts via the site, that would be great too. So that's all I have to say on the site. But again, if you have any questions, please just email that email address at the bottom of the screen. And that's it from me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Colleen, and thank you, Alessio. Yeah, I haven't seen any raised hand at the moment. I mean, so far, is there any questions? Any questions or any comments from our participants? No. Okay. Thank you. Okay. So let's move on then. So I apologize again for I forgot about the name of the third journal of SPA. So it's the Journal of International and Comparative Social Policy. So together with Journal of Social Policy and our Journal of Social Policy and Society. So there are now three journals under the SPA and all published by the Cambridge University Press. Okay. So I mean, yeah. So we have given you a lot of information so far. So it's just one more piece of information before we have a little break before the annual lecture. Okay, so as mentioned in Alessio's slide, so in each issue we have a theme section. So usually the theme section will be proposed by our prospective guest editor on a topic of their expertise or on some timely issue. So this time we want to make this special call for proposal for a theme section because so next year, 2022, will be the 80th anniversary of the Beveridge Report. So we want to call for a proposal for the some special theme sections in order to put more energy, put more new insights into the welfare state debate. So we have this title for the special series is called Towards the Centenary of the Beveridge Report, a debate on the welfare state for the next 20 years. So you can see that this special series is not just about looking back on what happened since Beveridge Report, but it's based on the previous debate that we have on welfare state. We want to look forward to the next 20 years. So we welcome any topic which are under or unexplored in the existing literature or any new areas that it is important in the upcoming debate about welfare state. So this special theme section will be published between 2022 to 24 because we know that it takes about a year, to actually write up the theme section, and then there will be a process of assessing and reviewing the proposals as well. So the deadline for this special call is 15th of November. So during this period, we will welcome theme section proposals for this particular call, and also we will welcome theme section proposals for in general as well. So we are not saying that we are stopped receiving other theme section proposals. So the both calls will go parallel. So we are receiving proposals for other theme section and also proposals for this particular call as well. So you'll find the requirements in the instruction for contributors. And if you have some preliminary idea and you're not quite sure, or maybe you want some advice, so please contact us through the SPS editor email as well. And then we can have some discussion before you put together your proposal. Okay, so again, because the chat is still not working, so I'm just checking if Alessio, Colleen, or Amy, do you have anything to add? No. Okay. So is there any questions or any comments from our audience? Okay, so that's good. So we haven't used a lot of time on this general business. Okay, so we'll have a 5 minutes very quick screen break now, and then when we come back, we will have the we will have the annual lecture that we all look forward to for a long time. Okay, so my clock is 4:30 at the moment, so we'll come back at 4:35. So if you haven't make a coffee before we start, so go to make a coffee, and then I'll also show the abstract and the speaker's information on the screen if you want to have a look before the lecture start. So okay, so see you in 5 minutes time then. Thank you.
Once again, Ruby and I, and on behalf of the editorial board of social policy and society, we're really delighted to have Kevin Farnsworth and Zoe Irving as presenters for this annual lecture of SPS, whose title, you can see it here, is Austerity, Toxicity, Hostility, Welfare States, and the Lost Decade. Now, Kevin and Zoe are readers, both in social policy, if I'm correct, at the University of York. They have worked together on a number of initiatives, and among those, there are two edited collections published by Policy Press, one called Social Policy in Challenging Times back in 2011, and more recently in 2015, one called Social Policy in Times of Austerity. So you can pretty see quite a thread there. As was mentioned before by Ruby, they are the editors and in fact the founding co-editors of the Journal of International and Comparative Social Policy, one of the 3 journals in the SPA package. Kevin has also published numerous other books and chapters and articles on topics of corporate welfare and business power in social policy. And among Zoe's recent works, there is a co-authored volume called Exploring the World of Social Policy, an International Approach with Michael Hill. I would also want to remind you one more time that back in January with SPS, we published a theme section, guest edited by Kevin and Zoe, which to an extent forms the premise of this lecture, called A Hostile Decade for Social Policy, Economic Crisis, Political Crisis, and Austerity. And in the introduction of that theme section, they define austerity as an objectively bad idea. So one of the interesting things about that theme section is trying to understand how it was possible that such a bad idea became also one of the defining traits of social policy over the last decade. What's going to happen in the next decade or two? It's to an extent maybe something we'd like to find out in that new special theme section that Ruby was talking about, but I think we're going to hear something about the future as well from Kevin and Zoe. So they will be talking for about 45, 60 minutes. And then at the end of that, we'll have another 20, 30 minutes for comments and questions from the audience. Once again, there seems to be some problems with the chat these days. So try to write a question in the chat if you can see the chat. Otherwise, please raise your electronic hand and I will call your name when the Q&A slot comes. Okay, so without any further ado, the floor is yours, Kevin and Zoe. I don't know who's starting, but yeah, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Alessio. And thanks, Alessio, Ruby and Vari for inviting us to do the lecture. And also a big thanks to Magella and to Liam, who originally invited us this time last year, well, earlier than this time last year. So we weren't imagining that we would ever do it in this context, but here we are. And also thank you to the audience for tuning in. We know it's a very busy time of year and we appreciate your time. We can't promise any mood uplift with what we're going to say today, but hopefully we'll have some good discussion at the end. So as Alessio said then, mine and Kevin's talks today are based on the work that we published in a theme section in January, which focused on the decade between 2010 and 2020, which also included some excellent contributions from Fiona Duclos on the recommodification of welfare states and erosion of citizenship, from Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummings, both global social policy practitioners, looking at austerity in the global north and south. Heki Kilamo on household over-indebtedness during the austerity decade, and finally an article by David Bailey, Nikolai Huke, Paul Lewis and Sari Shibata looking at the class struggle during the austerity period, and Kevin and I both refer to them at various points along the way today. So we're going to try and talk for about 20 minutes each, and set out the key ideas and some further reflections that come from the events over the last 18 months, and then leave plenty of time to discuss and answer questions. So to begin, as Alessio said, we did define austerity as an objectively bad idea, and perhaps that's not the best definition of a term if you want to go on and measure it from that. But I guess in our previous work, Kevin and I have argued that as a very basic economic definition, the idea that austerity represents a deep and prolonged reduction in public spending. But other than that, it's a very slippery idea. And if you want to think about the social and political consequences, then it's very empirically imprecise. So I don't want to spend any more time trying to define it at this point. But what's clear is that as an economic strategy, it's caused an enormous amount of hardship for individuals, for countries, and for whole regions over that decade, 2010 to 2020. And there's a massive research now that chronicles those hardships at the local level and at the national level. And in our themed section, Isabel Ortiz and Matthew Cummings also provide some really quite alarming data in their article that shows just how widespread and normalised cutbacks and restrictions to social provision have became in that decade, and how they've been baked in to the future plans, particularly in the global south, and such that this kind of Austerian baseline is conceived as the new normal for social policy making. And they looked at over 600 IMF country reports, which is a punishment in itself, and data for 187 different countries, and found that the idea of fiscal adjustment as an essential component of social policy planning was overwhelmingly present. So this was the pre-COVID picture, despite many commentators at the time reasoning that there were chinks of light in spending that signalled the end of austerity. So to go on to set out my key ideas then, the problem with austerity is that it's not just an economic mechanism that can be switched on and off. And its toxicity in particular is found in the ways that it poisons the future. So thinking about what's going to happen over the next 10 years, we have to look at what the impact of austerity has been on that future. And it poisons the future not only for people at the micro level, but also more widely for existing welfare states, and also for potential welfare states in the making. As we can infer from the data that Ortiz and Cummings have produced. So this is a problem for arguments that focus on spending as the indicator of whether austerity is present or absent, because asking whether spending is happening or not isn't really the right question, because that's an input question rather than an outcome question. And this is for two reasons, I guess. Firstly, because spending would need to be significantly higher to repair the damage caused by any period of austerity, but also because austerity isn't just a matter of economics. Its social and political consequences are also important, and potentially more important when they determine future capacity for achieving distributional change. So, to help put my argument in a framework, I used Paul Wilding's 1992 article on Thatcher's enduring legacy, which I think is a really important piece of writing, and which I found really edifying when I first read it as a student in 1992. And 30 years on, again, a really useful basis for thinking about the period from 2010. And if you'll read it, you'll know that it's what he called an exercise in analysis and prophecy, and in fact was a remarkably accurate picture of what occurred over the subsequent 2 decades. He identified 10 different ideas, reforms, challenges, processes, effects that represented what he would consider significant change for the welfare state, so enduring change. What he didn't consider in 1992 was the legacy beyond the UK, and he didn't necessarily foresee the 2008 global crisis. But to help think about those elements, obviously we can just look back in history and see the economic drivers for extremism and nationalism in political responses to crisis. So part of the reason for beginning from Wilding's characterisation of Thatcher's legacy is that in many ways austerity can be seen, and has been argued to be, to represent the pinnacle of Thatcher's legacy, or the point at which its constituents, at least, have become the most concentrated. But at this point, I think austerity has generated its own legacy that goes beyond the kind of things identified by Wilding. So in my article, I condensed and reconceptualised Wilding's discussion of 10 legacies into 4 key themes, and this was to try and account for the global dimensions of austerity and to think about it in terms of ideas, societies, economics and politics. So I just want to outline them now. And then finish with some reflections before Kevin takes over and thinks more about the picture in the UK. So the first legacy of austerity in terms of ideas is the way in which it normalised a non-commitment to welfare. And this occurred because austerity focused all attention on the economic and transactional dimensions of public spending and pretty much erased the kind of transformational, solidaristic and integrative dimensions that the expansion of social policy had come to represent. So social policy now is really, for governments, a matter of treating the symptoms of capitalism's failings as cheaply as possible, rather than a matter of social progress or recognising what Ian Gough pointed out in 1979, that there's a burden on people of work rather than the other way around. So I think we can see this in different processes, and the ones that I note in the article are not only the advanced processes of residualisation across benefits and services, but most clearly in the rise of xenophobia and ethno-nationalism in terms of welfare politics in particular, where in the absence of austerity, it would have been hoped that the kinds of solidarities that were emerging could have expanded. And a COVID example of this, I guess, is the way that vaccine nationalism has developed and operated. Despite G7 countries obviously recently offering 1 billion vaccines between them, this still doesn't enable countries to produce their own vaccines. And so the welfare commons idea isn't reflected in deeds rather than in words. So admittedly, it's always more difficult to try and demonstrate how ideas show up in the day-to-day of policy, and we often tend to fall back on opinion surveys to fill the gaps. So we tend to expect that there's more sympathy for the welfare state in harder times, and that's what the research tends to show. And there's also evidence from the World Values Survey that sympathy is often lower for welfare states in more residual welfare states. This idea is kind of supported in other surveys too, that they indicate a lowering of expectation about what the welfare state can or should do. So this idea of a non-commitment to welfare is reflected in these breaking down of solidarities, but also in the idea that there's been a breakdown in the legitimacy of reliance on the welfare state, so the relationship to it. So secondly, then, in terms of societies, the legacy of austerity is societal scarring, which has not really been recognised in public policy. And is really presented in 2 different ways. Firstly, obviously on the impact on life chances of people affected immediately by austerity cuts. And this, as I noted earlier, is going to take a lot more than a return to pre-crisis levels of spending to try and to repair the damage. And part of the reason why the reparations are not on the radar, on the policy radar, is because not only are those who will need it most least politically powerful, but also because political demand will fall at the local level, because that's where the cuts have been devolved to in large part in most countries. So this is eventually going to translate, and probably sooner rather than later, given the last year, into a chronic inverse welfare effect over the coming decades. And a COVID example of this, I guess, is the debate around the education catch-up provision in the UK at the moment. which kind of illustrates this problem. And societal scarring then is also linked, obviously, to the non-commitment to welfare, in the sense that the social dispersion and process of othering that have occurred, which always accompany a harder fight for resources, means that the solidarities which are a prerequisite for welfare state building are also eroded. So the kinds of intergenerational, international, anti-racist and so on, and the rise of culture wars, xenophobia, disharmony, all these things tend to suit governments because they nurture mistrust and then prevent shared interests, which then would lead on to political mobilisation. And in relation to the economy, the legacy of austerity for working life really is the most significant for social policy too. And this is found in the ways that it's removed pressures to make work decent and to compensate people when it isn't. And Fiona Duclos' article in our theme section shows clearly how the recommodification of labour has sped up through the decade of austerity, to the point where so basically flexploitation has become much easier because more people are more desperate for work, and because there's less shelter from non-work. So simply put, that's how it's operated. And again, in terms of reparations, the amount of re-regulation of the labour market that would be required to address all those insecurities of income and working hours and protection and prospects is huge. And finally, then, in terms of the politics, the legacy of austerity is really significant here, and it's the diminished capacity for change, the political capacity for change. And this is significant because even if it were true that austerity was over, and I think Kevin will show clearly that it isn't, the question remains as to how we can rebuild welfare states after that period of decline, and how social policy can be re-articulated around its social purpose rather than its economic efficiencies. And we know that class solidarities, that the power of labour are essential ingredients in welfare state building, and it's been clear for some time that union density, for example, has been in decline. So not just as a result of austerity, but its contraction in the proportion of public sector workers caused by austerity has inevitably added to the decline in union density, and more widely also acted as a brake on the other solidarity building effects of working in the public sector, one of which is diversity in the workplace. So that's one element of political capacity. The second is the class solidarities, and the decline of the middle class in OECD countries has been widely reported by the OECD. And the extent to which the middle class in middle and low income countries are also demobilised to support the welfare state is significant, and basically because without middle class buy-in, welfare states don't get built. So these factors combine with some of the other effects of austerity already mentioned, the localisation of cuts, the increasing social divisions, and all add up to a hostile and toxic mix of circumstances as far as mobilising resistance to austerity is concerned. And David Bailey and colleagues show how this has played out in a range of different countries, with very limited impact on resisting austerity. And so the conclusions drawn then really are that even if austerity were over, these legacies are a set of chronic limiting conditions for welfare states and social policy development. And in terms of a post-COVID settlement, the picture isn't very encouraging. None of these areas has seen a reversal of fortune over the last year, and for various reasons, COVID will of course make all these things even more problematic. And so I'll pass over to Kevin now to explore this a bit further with a particular focus on the UK.
Okay, is this all working properly? Can you hear me, Zoe? Okay, Zoe's frozen. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you,
Yes.
Irving.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
go
you.
on.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay,
And I can see you as well.
that's a. Well, I was going to say that's a bonus. I'm not sure it is, but there you go. Okay, well, thank you, Zoe. I mean, that really sets up my paper really nicely, and is actually a tough act to follow. But I'll try my best. My paper shifts the focus somewhat. It shifts the focus to the UK, and and also because the papers themselves are available through open access, I deliberately want to try to sort of think about the future a little bit, or at least the present, as well as the past, because obviously quite a lot has happened since certainly since we wrote these papers, and we first and they were accepted for the journal. I want to begin by foregrounding my paper in terms of three core ideas that I think help to present a bit of background. The first point is that welfare states often emerge out of crisis. And certainly, as Alessio identified, Zoe and I have written quite a lot on crisis and then austerity that comes out of crisis. So welfare states often themselves emerge out of national crises, and they play a key role in managing and alleviating crises once they develop. The second point is that the decade of austerity, which obviously is featured here as part of this special issue, was a particular response to crisis. It was a particular response to the banking crisis and the Great Recession. And it's important to sort of to consider this, especially when we also reflect on subsequent crises that have hit the state. In the UK, and my focus is going to be primarily on the UK and really primarily on Westminster, austerity was a political project which was designed to facilitate a response to crisis, which saw a reconfiguration, I argue in my paper, of the welfare state to shift it away from undeserving recipients to deserving recipients, towards middle income groups, and what I've referred to previously as corporate welfare, and I'll expand on that idea shortly. The third point is that austerity has continued to define the way in which public and social policies are viewed and are enacted in the UK and elsewhere. In the UK, it influenced the Brexit vote. We can't make sense of Brexit without thinking about austerity and crisis. And of course, it also helped to shape the COVID response. So that's the kind of foregrounding to the paper. I want to start the paper proper by considering austerity and sort of returning to the more definitional aspects of austerity. As Zoe identified, really we tended to see austerity as deep and sustained cuts in public expenditure, but as Zoe's paper illustrates, it's about actually much more than that. Mark Blythe, who's probably done most to define austerity and put austerity on the mainstream agenda, argued that austerity is a voluntary deflation to restore competitiveness. Now, Zoe and I actually neither see austerity as being necessarily voluntary. That can be seen actually if we look at the cuts made in Greece and Ireland. And nor is it necessarily about competitiveness. Austerity actually in the UK as it unfolded is really an end goal scenario. It's austerity was, well, the purpose of austerity was the reconfiguration of the welfare state, as I've already indicated. Austerity was about redistributing welfare provision away from the undeserving to the deserving, and as I said, to corporations through corporate welfare. Of course, that wasn't the official line. The official line, which which really was developed by the Conservative-led coalition from 2010, was that the primary purpose of austerity was to reduce the annual deficit and also reduce public debt, which echoed some of those points made by the IMF, as represented in Ortiz's paper and mentioned by Zoe. Thus, austerity in the UK was presented as a non-ideological response, and something that really, I suppose, in how it was introduced, was time limited. However, it was neither of those things. So from the outset, the Conservative part of the coalition government in particular, led by then Prime Minister David Cameron and George Osborne as Chancellor of the Exchequer, set out to create a new narrative of austerity, which actually we've referred to elsewhere as neo-austerity, because in many ways it delinks somewhat the economics from the politics. The starting point for the coalition government was that we're all in this together, which George Osborne argued. David Cameron also argued that at various times. Austerity was created, a narrative was created that traded on populism, a particular common sense solution to the profligacy of the previous administration. The language that was used sort of echoed previous Thatcher agenda, which compared national economies to family budgets. David Cameron repeatedly made the point that actually the UK had maxed out its credit card, and that debt now needed to be repaid. There was no alternative response that was plausible or possible, based according to the coalition government, according to Cameron and Osborne in particular. So Cameron made the argument that we're tackling the deficit because we have to, not out of some ideological zeal. This is a government led by people with a practical desire to sort out the country's problems, not through ideology. And later, Cameron argued that I wish there was another way. I wish there was an easier way, but I tell you, there is no other responsible way. Back in May, we inherited public finances that can only be described as catastrophic, according to Cameron. So there's an attempt to set up this narrative that divorced politics from ideology, that set up the argument around austerity as an inevitable policy, and the only choice, really, the only choice that the coalition government had. At least that's what it was set out to be. Later, as the quote illustrates in my paper, Cameron went on to argue that we're sticking to the task, and that doesn't mean just making difficult decisions on public spending. It also means something more profound. It means building a leaner, more efficient state. We need to do less with more, not just now, but permanently. If clearly austerity in reality was anything but non-ideological. Austerity actually was used to tackle a perceived problem, the comprehensive publicly funded welfare state. Austerity drew also, and this is a really important point, I think, when sort of tied again into Zoe's paper. It drew on sort of romantic notions of a golden age of Britain and the UK. During the aftermath of the Second World War, where a kind of powerful, victorious colonial or post-colonial power rallied its subjects in a collective endeavour to repay debt, to restore the economy, to rebuild the nation. Of course, a lot of this is myth-making, but it's also interesting that a lot of those myths were then repeated. The very same narrative was used to rally support for Brexit. In reality, of course, the country wasn't in it together. the deficit wasn't Labour's fault, the cuts were not inevitable, and the medicine that was prescribed, austerity, did not fix the economy. Nonetheless, austerity was employed successfully to reconfigure the welfare state. So austerity, it's true, was less about cutting expenditure across the board and more about what Dan Edmiston has referred to as fiscal recalibration, or as I have argued previously, welfare state reconfiguration, which prioritized corporate welfare whilst targeting cuts on social welfare. And by corporate welfare here, I'm referring to provision that prioritizes the needs and interests of business and operates to socialize corporate risks. And we can see that if we think back to the crisis period, to take me back to the beginning of the paper. In the UK and elsewhere, the welfare state helped to rescue and rebuild economies. But the coalition government also maintained that the welfare state was also a problem that stood in the way of recovery. In the end, in order to bail out banks and to prop up the economy, the UK poured billions of pounds into rescuing banks and, by extension, the wealthiest in society. The New Economics Foundation has estimated that at the time, at the height, the exposure of the UK state was worth around £1.3 trillion, a huge, eye-watering sum of money. But in order to repay the costs of the crisis, in order to repay the costs of the bank bailouts, the coalition government set to put in place austerity that squeezed the poorest, most vulnerable in society. A direct redistribution, in a way, from social welfare to corporate welfare, and of resources from the poorest to the richest. But austerity didn't end there. The framing of austerity was also about creating a scenario that stigmatized the very poorest. In a way, the government had to set up a narrative that would allow benefits to be cut from the most vulnerable. And think about how that took place if you were actually in the UK at the time. Recall George Osborne's suggestion, for instance, that those in work have a right to be angry at those languishing on benefits, sleeping off their benefits while hard-working citizens paid them effectively for the privilege. The rhetoric was as nasty as it was prejudiced, and someone in close proximity to Osborne, Nick Clegg, who's leader of the Liberal Democrats within the coalition and Deputy Prime Minister, I think captures quite well what was going on. Clegg argues that welfare for Osborne was just a bottomless pit of savings, and it didn't really matter what the human consequences were, because focus groups had shown that the voters they wanted to appeal to were very anti-welfare, and therefore there was almost no limit to those anti-welfare prejudices. So cuts were made, but the biggest cuts were actually targeted most on two key areas, really. Squeezing benefits to working age population, and also squeezing local authority subsidies. And if you look at the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, they contain a line-by-line accounts of costs and savings against policy changes, which I think help to capture just how much the government relied on expenditure within the DWP. The consequences, in some ways, were inevitable. And that was powerfully captured by Philip Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty, when he said in his report that the bottom line is that much of the glue that has held British society together since the Second World War has been deliberately removed and replaced with a harsh and uncaring ethos. A booming economy, high employment, and a budget surplus have not reversed austerity, a policy pursued, in his words, more as an ideological than an economic agenda. And incidentally, the outcome of those severe cuts, around 20 to 25 billion pound saving from working age benefits, is actually not dissimilar to the most conservative estimates of the direct and final costs of the banking bailout, which, according to the National Audit Office, was worth around 27 billion pounds. Back to the operationalization of austerity. It's important to point out, of course, that even if the government had a point, even if they had to balance the budget, they could have done so without simply imposing greater austerity, greater cuts. They could have used the tax system, but actually that was ruled out very early on by the coalition government. Tax increases were shunned in favour of expenditure cuts. And there's all kinds of comparative data that illustrate actually what the UK government did at the time. The OECD calculates that the ratio of expenditure cuts to tax increases was around 80 to 20%, or 80 to 20 in the UK. The OECD average was 65 to 35. And taxes on the wealthiest, including the wealthiest corporations, were actually cut. And if there are still any doubts as a direction of travel, consider this. At the first opportunity that George Osborne had in changing tack, it was back in 2015, prior to the general election and the first giveaway budget. And as the Resolution Foundation reported at the time, around 80% of the giveaways from that budget went to the richest 20%, while the poorest 20% actually saw their incomes fall. And nothing really changed much under Theresa May's government, despite a softening of the austerity rhetoric. So what we have here is austerity for some, but not for others. We have growing inequality and poverty. We also have, as some of my colleagues in social policy have already identified, more billionaires created during austerity at that time of austerity than any time before. Oxfam have done quite a lot of work on this. The gap between rich and poor increasing further, not only because of austerity, but also of the COVID pandemic. And meanwhile, there was a priority placed on provision that would continue, and this is spending as well as taxation, to favour corporate interests. I want to sort of move on now and finish by sort of thinking about not only the present but also the future, and maybe this can be taken up in the questions and answer session. A paradox of today in the welfare state is that over the past few decades, more and more has been demanded of the welfare state to tackle economic problems and resolve crises, but also there's the risk that the welfare state has been depreciated so much, has been rolled back so much, that the welfare state is less and less able to adequately fulfill that role. And this, of course, echoes Wolfgang Streeck's concerns about the sustainability of welfare state going forward. In the past 12 years alone, the UK has been subjected to the banking crisis, the Great Recession, Brexit, and COVID. And all of those crises were linked in multiple ways. And although I haven't touched on it at all, nor will I have time to, the climate crisis also looms large. Austerity certainly weakened the UK's capacity to respond to COVID, and there's been quite a lot of work done by the BMA that has looked at this in quite some detail. Austerity certainly weakened the UK's capacity for the NHS to deal with COVID, and this is a relatively protected department within the state. The COVID crisis as well, though, has had other impacts. The COVID crisis appears, for example, to have exposed the lie that the government had no choice but to implement austerity in the first place. The UK's public sector debt, when Cameron was identifying it as such a problem, was equivalent to around 69% of GDP in 2009-10. Today, it exceeds 104% of GDP, according to the OBR. Meanwhile, the cost of COVID interventions have been estimated by the National Audit Office to be around £372 billion over the last couple of years. And the largest part, incidentally, is accounted for by supports to private businesses. So £150 billion support for private businesses, £97 billion support for health and social care, £54 billion support for individuals, which includes the furlough schemes and support to the self-employed. Will that test austerity and any threat to reintroduce austerity in future? Will it open minds to the importance of the welfare state? A question I think that is interesting to think about going forward is, will the millions who have effectively benefited from the welfare state through the furlough scheme, through employer subsidies, employee protection, extended protections for the self-employed, many of whom would previously not have viewed themselves as recipients of welfare, now be more favourably predisposed to the welfare state? Will voters have noticed the misappropriation of funds, the fact that the government has lost now 2 court cases only this last week for awarding contracts to its allies without due diligence, as the Good Law project has documented and tried? All the wasting of funds, thinking about the £43 billion, the failed test and trace programme. More importantly, who will pay the costs of the COVID measures going forward? Or will the government, will those costs be evenly distributed? Or will the government turn again to austerity to rebalance the economy once the COVID crisis subsides? As Zoe said, this is not an optimistic talk, and I'm not especially optimistic in thinking through those issues, those questions. The present government talks about building back better, for example. Yet beyond the rhetoric, the policies that are being put forward with most enthusiasm seems to set the UK on a path that is further towards corporate welfare and not social welfare. The investment environment that the government is seeking to develop post-Brexit is based on cheap labour, low taxation and low regulations. Now that's not new, but the emphasis on creating that kind of regime coming out of COVID and entering into the Brexit phase, I think will be limiting in terms of social policy. If you want more examples of that, I've actually done quite a lot of work into investment regimes, or simply take a look at how the Department for International Trade currently sells the UK potentially to new investors. Meanwhile, as part of Brexit, subsidies to farmers and businesses have been effectively largely protected for the foreseeable future. There have been moves in the other direction. Recently, there's been moves to agree a 15% minimum corporation tax, but it's interesting that one day after that international agreement, and Rishi Sunak was trying to gain an exemption for the city from that particular agreement. And if we look at more recent evidence, austerity threatens certainly to re-emerge at the moment as the COVID crisis subsides. The benefit uplift will almost certainly disappear in the next few months, and the last budget was built on a whole range of assumptions that will likely hit the poorest hardest. The IFS documented a whole range of hidden cuts amounting to a further 8.5% of cuts in the next 2 years. And what's important to note here is that the flexibility for the government to impose those cuts in all areas, in all departments, is actually incredibly limited. The choices of where to impose cuts are limited by the guarantees that have been provided, for example, for NHS funding, the pensions guarantees, and not to mention a whole range of other budgetary constraints that stem from things like PFI. Servicing PFI is a non-discretionary budget item and costs around £10 billion a year. And if that's not bad enough, the economic omens also aren't good. It seems that the austerity experiment actually didn't put the UK in a very strong position at all economically, and Brexit, of course, has added to that. So that only a couple of days ago, the OECD released new data that showed that the UK contracted more than any other OECD country as a result of COVID. Now, if that doesn't sound pessimistic enough, I'm not even sure, if we want to be optimistic, that it's actually possible to be so. I'm not sure it's possible for the welfare state to actually beat a more progressive path without root and branch reform of British capitalism that better reconciles, at the very least, the competing needs and interests of business and labour. Now, that actually looked more possible under Theresa May's version of industrial policy. It certainly looked much more credible and possible under Labour's industrial strategy under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell. But the present government's reforms and plans seem at present to look quite confused, often very rhetorical and ill-considered. And I can't see that they'll do very much at all to re-establish the welfare contract. Indeed, the post-COVID reforms and post-Brexit reforms actually may make the UK look even, or the UK welfare state even less tenable and less progressive than it is at the moment. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you ever so much to Zoe and Kevin for this really wide-ranging and thought-provoking, maybe not necessarily uplifting, but nonetheless quite interesting presentation.